This video is long overdue. It's on the topic of mental health. You know, as much as we talk about the importance of mental illness and of spreading awareness and of destigmatization and so on, in comparison, we don't seem to have much, if anything, really to say about psychological well-being, what that might involve. It's almost as if we're left to assume that mental health must just be the absence of a mental illness. But of course, that wouldn't be right. That would be defining it in relation to what it's not. It's kind of like asking someone, how are you doing today? And they say, not bad. Well, it does tell you something, but it isn't exactly informative. It would also seem to set the bar quite low where, perhaps the most we could expect or hope for is something just barely above coping. It doesn't tell us what it might mean to thrive, what it is that we could be aiming at or striving for, what the ideal mode of being for a person could be, perhaps what it should be. And therein lies part of the problem, if you want to call it that. So I don't know if there's a way of defining mental health that is value neutral. In other words, no matter what proposal or definition, suggestion you put forward as to what you think mental health is, you will, whether you intend to or not, instill it with certain values, perhaps even suggesting that there's an implicit moral framework that we should be abiding by, or that there are virtues that you would see us embody or uphold or defend. So people who live by very different standards or values, they may just outright reject your definition of mental health. So some people may define mental health in terms of, the absence of mental illness. Some people would define it in terms of the absence of distressing symptoms. Some people would define it in terms of hedonistic pleasures. Other people would define it in terms of psychological freedom and whatnot. So if you follow through this video and you make it to the end, you may just shrug your shoulders and say, well, that doesn't work for me. That doesn't resonate with me in terms of how I orient myself in the world. And that's fine. This video is perhaps not for you. But to those of you who share some of the same intuitions and maybe share some similar values and moral sentiments, my hope is that what follows will resonate with you and further strengthen what you already feel to be true. Now, this topic, mental health, is, I think, the most important subject that I've ever tried to address on this channel. And I hope to do it justice if I can. And I'm going to go down a bit of a tangential path here. I promise that it is all connected, at least in the way that I see things. But the timeliness and the importance of us talking about psychological well-being cannot be overstated, in my opinion. So from what I can see, we are living in a society, a culture, an age that increasingly it is not at all conducive to psychological wellness. In fact, quite the opposite. We seem to be moving in a direction where it is detrimental to our mental functioning. So it's the ways in which we are encouraged to think or not think, as the case may be. The increasing propensity for people to speak in, slogans and catchphrases, jargon, the increased polarization, the emotional currency of society writ large that seems increasingly to condone and encourage the trading in a kind of prideful arrogance, resentment, and even outright hatred. The ways in which it's become normalized to interact with people who differ significantly from ourselves in terms of how they think, how they interpret the world, how they prioritize their own values and their way of going about living. The ease with which we seem capable of villainizing such people or scapegoating groups of people. None of this, in my opinion, is healthy. None of this is good. None of this bodes well for us in the long run. And as much as I'd like to maybe get into examples or instances of the kind of thing that I'm referring to, if you don't sense it, if you don't feel it at this point, I'm not sure how helpful that would be. So it's been said that, there's nothing good about appearing well-adjusted in a sick society. And I believe that we are living in a sick society increasingly every day. It seems to be getting worse. And if you don't sense it, if you don't feel it by now, you should really have a look inward and take inventory of some of these things. We'll get into that in a minute. But the social media platforms themselves, limit what you can say, of course. So the Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, these are, as some of you know, the modern day town square. This is where ideally we ought to be able to put forward our ideas, our opinions, our thoughts, competing interpretations, engaging one another in a respectful and healthy exchange of ideas, even debate. But even on the smaller platforms, the social media platforms that allow for this kind of thing and are more friendly to it, increasingly I'm seeing that people are either unwilling or incapable of doing that kind of thing. Again, which speaks volumes about the polarization at present in society and also just the state of society itself, sadly. But the platforms themselves, as many of you know, they are owned by these multi-billionaire tech oligarchs with a tremendous amount of power and influence and control over the information flow. So what you are able to see and hear and be exposed to is very much controlled by these very powerful entities. So what we've done there is that we've grown accustomed to, or we've allowed for a kind of deferring to these powerful entities that have their own vested interests, right? I don't think it's right to assume that their primary interest is your well-being and my well-being. So we defer to them to tell us or to know in advance what we should take as informative, what is true, and what is potentially misinformation. So we have outsourced, this is all related to mental health, by the way, we have outsourced the act of predication. That is the ability to affirm or deny or qualify patterns of meaning. That's what thinking is as an act, as opposed to just a passive event where you're trading in content or something. We have deferred to these entities to do that work for us. And many people celebrate this. Many people think that this is a good thing. And I presume in part it's because they have so little trust in their fellow human being to be able to, with any effectiveness at all, to be able to discern truth from falsehood, from being able to think critically, or otherwise they believe that they're kind of arrogant. They feel like they just are so certain of their worldview or their beliefs, their ideas that happen to be perfectly in line with maybe these powerful social media entities. They can't entertain the possibility that another person coming from a different frame or challenging or criticizing something like that, they might have something of value to say, which again says a lot about our society at present. So we've allowed ourselves to be infantilized in terms of our ability to think for ourselves. Now increasingly the thinking is done for us, and we are reduced in a sense, to just mere consumers of content that has already been digested for us and offered to us through a frame which we don't see and we're not allowed to question. And anyone who has studied history in any depth, you know that this doesn't lead to a good place. So we're infantilized in terms of our ability to think for ourselves. We're also being infantilized in terms of our ability to regulate our emotions in the presence of ideas that we find extremely disagreeable. So many of these policies are allegedly put into place to protect people from being offended or hurt or, this kind of thing. But there's a statement put forward by, I believe, Albert Camus that is worth thinking about. And he says that for the good of the people has always been the alibi of tyrants, and that is worth meditating on. So the public good, the protecting people, the safety, this kind of thing, these are the justifications put forward for the censorship, the taking control of the information that we're exposed to, and so on. But none of that, in my opinion, is good. None of that bodes well for us. Now, if all this sounds strange, if it sounds peculiar, or you're not sure what to make of it, I might suggest humbly that you might have some part to play in this, that there might be some work to be done there, just in terms of looking at yourself and seeing what's going on there. And I would encourage all of us, myself included, to engage in this sort of thing. Take a look at how we operate in the world. How strongly do we hold to our own opinions, ideas, theories about the right way to approach people in the world at large? Are we able to engage in a kind of intellectual humility? Are we able to entertain the possibility that we ourselves might be mistaken, that someone else coming from a very different set of ideas and beliefs or prioritization of values, that they might have some insight that we ourselves are blind to, that we lack? Do we have enough intellectual humility to do that? Can we understand, someone who has a different way of thinking on their terms, where they feel understood by us? We don't have to agree with them, but can we do that at least? Or will we tend to imagine, a caricature of who this person is that allows us to then just readily dismiss them as either unintelligent or worse, as someone who is immoral? And both of those interpretations would perhaps justify us, treating them in some pretty harsh ways. What is our capacity for regulating our own emotions in the presence of someone with whom we disagree, perhaps strongly? Are we able to, kind of engage in a kind of forbearance, patience, humility? Can we, feel compassion toward them, even though we don't agree with them? Can we empathize with them? Are we still capable of doing that? Are we in tune with our own emotions and with our common humanity to be able to do that? Or do we find ourselves reacting impulsively and with hostility? Be honest with yourself. Like, have a good look at that. Consider what that might be. And most importantly, I would say, these days in where things are kind of heading, there's a very important question here we should all be asking, which is, are there morals or values that you embody, that you try to live by, that transcend your preferred conceptual community, your ideology that you might be kind of caught up in, whatever your religious or non-religious beliefs, whatever your political worldview? Like, are you able to, through these morals and values, are you able to connect with your fellow human beings and see them as such, as a person worthy of care and dignity and respect, even though they may have ideas and beliefs and opinions that you disagree with? Or is your moral, ethical duty only to those, who are part of your tribe? That would not be a good sign. That would not be a good indicator. Another way of putting this is, would there be a line, where enough people within your tribe, your conceptual community, your political worldview, whatever it is, would there be a line that if enough people were to cross this line, the lines would be your morals, your values, these transcendental higher order morals and values. If they were to cross that line, you would not only voluntarily remove yourself, disidentify from this conceptual community, but you would also actively turn against it. Do you know what that line is? Can you sense that line? Can you feel that line within yourself? I think it's very important for all of us to be asking that question. We can give all kinds of historical examples of where there was a failure to identify that line within ourselves. People who lived during the 1930s and 40s and saw the rise of Nazi ideology. Many people just either turned a blind eye to it, or otherwise they got, caught up, swept up in the slogans, the jargon, and all the rest of it, the propaganda, and it allowed for these horrible atrocities to be committed, that the people did not sense that line within themselves. And likewise, and unfortunately we're not taught nearly enough about this, which is worth thinking about, by the way, the totalitarian ideologies, where they not only want your body, they want your mind, they want your soul, they want to be in possession of your thoughts. The communist Soviet Russia, and these ideas that would serve as justifications for scapegoating the bourgeoisie, the kulaks, and would justify the torture, the starvation, and the murder of millions upon millions of people. Likewise, these individuals who were caught up in that whole society, they did not identify that line. And these two instances, by the way, in my opinion, these would be textbook examples of sick societies, right? And anyone who's trending in the direction of some semblance of mental health, like, you will feel that there's something off there. You will feel that there's something not okay. It is a distressing, disorienting, unnerving sensation. So that is important to consider. We talk about having the courage of our convictions, but as Nietzsche put forward, it is perhaps more important for us to have the courage to expose our most strongly held convictions to challenge, to falsification. Again, it goes back to that intellectual humility. Do you have that kind of courage? We all need to have that kind of courage. Otherwise, we get polarized and we lose ourselves, in a sense. I'm going to get into that, in a little bit here. But Rollo May, who was a famous psychiatrist, somewhat similarly, he said that the opposite of courage is not cowardice, but conformity. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that statement, and we have a lot of people these days who are conformists. They think that it's a virtue to be obedient, to do what one does, to say what one says, and they fit in. They have this sense of belonging. They believe that this is a virtue or something. It is not, it is not. In time, it may very well make you complicit. It takes courage to stand alone. It takes genuine courage to do that. It doesn't take courage to go with the flow, to do what everyone else is doing. When you are arguing on the same side as the most powerful institutions in society, parroting the exact same things that are being said and expressed through our governments, our educational systems, and in the mainstream media, that doesn't take courage. It doesn't take courage. So we want to look at this. We really want to look at this. So I'm going to talk about mental health. I'm going to put forward my sense of what that is, what I take that to be. You don't have to agree with it. And I hope I'm allowed to have my own opinion. Well, I'm certainly going to have it whether you like it or not. But I want to make it very clear, when I'm talking about mental health, I'm not presuming to be, the exemplar case of psychological well-being. I think I'm doing okay. I don't think anyone needs to worry about me. But I don't presume to have everything figured out. I don't presume to be, the embodiment of mental health that you should model yourself after, anything like that. In fact, some of the things that I've come to, and my intuitions and my feelings about a lot of this, it in part comes by way of introspection. So I've noticed, especially in recent years as I get older, patterns in my own ways of thinking at times, feelings, reactions, ways of engaging with other people, especially people that I disagree with. And I've noticed these things within myself that I didn't like. It didn't line up with who I took myself to be or who I wanted to be. And so I've been making steps to remedy this, So what I mean to say is that I believe I'm coming at this with a fair bit of humility. I'm certainly a work in progress, as I'm sure most, if not all of you are as well. But that doesn't mean that we can't put forward an ideal that we're striving for, that we're trying to attain, even though we might not be able to fully. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into this. What is mental health? So just as a starting point, and that's all that this is, like there's other layers that you definitely want to add to this. There are follow-up questions that you'd want to pose that would need to be addressed. But I would say that as a starting point, mental health for me involves the three main pillars of human psychology, or the three primary domains of human being. That is thinking, feeling, and acting, such that there is some stability, some consistency, coherency to it, but also enough flexibility and free play that affords a kind of adaptiveness, but also allows for authenticity and the expansion of psychological freedom. So I'm going to get into this. I'm going to lay out what that might look like. So at the level of thought, we are all operating within an infinite number of conceptual frames that allow the world to be revealed as intelligible, that allows us to navigate through it, to be able to make sense of what we find around us, for us to be able to perceive things, with some consistency. Without these conceptual frames, this background, kind of framing or way of understanding the world, we'd be spiraling off into chaos, a schizophrenic kind of way of being. So there's enough stability and coherency that things make sense. We have more explicit thoughts, which are abstractions, generalizations, language. We're able to communicate with one another, but also to talk to ourselves and so on. We have these higher levels of interpretation. But within all of that, we also have the intellectual humility to, consider the possibility that we might be ourselves mistaken, to be able to interrogate some of our own hidden assumptions, biases, hidden premises, and so on. We can entertain the possibility and take seriously the possibility that someone else, with a different set of ideas and beliefs and interpretations, that they might have some nuanced take that we don't see, that we lack. And so we're able to reevaluate our beliefs, our ideas in the face of evidence or better arguments. So there's a stability, but also we have a loose enough grip on our own preferences and beliefs and ideas and frameworks and hypotheses and so on, that we can reevaluate and navigate around that. So, in having this way of being, we are more likely to be in possession of our thoughts, as opposed to be owned by, some dominant ideology or some cultural hegemony or what have you. We're less likely to be the victim of propaganda. Now, when people think of propaganda, what comes to mind is like the Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia and this kind of thing. They don't imagine that propaganda plays into their day-to-day lives. And I don't know what to tell you. I mean, you don't have to look much further than advertising and marketing to understand that no, propaganda is everywhere. You've been exposed to it since the day that you were born. So the idea is that you are sold a belief or an idea or a frame that you've taken up in such a way that you believe that you came to this conclusion on your own. And that's kind of how propaganda works. But people who are able to question the frames themselves and question, their own hidden assumptions and so on, and kind of see through, at times, not always, some of the arguments and assumptions of others, then they're more resilient to that thing. So they're more, resistant to indoctrination, falling, into a kind of psychological anesthetic mode of being, dogma of all kinds of different sorts. So, we're in possession of our thoughts, increasingly so, less likely to be ideologically possessed, where our thoughts own us. So that's kind of what's happening there. So there's stability and also enough flexibility. At the level of feeling in our moods and emotions, we're able to be receptive to a wide range of moods and emotions that dial us into the world, that allows the world to show up as not just intelligible, but also meaningful. We feel energized. We feel like the world calls to us. It solicits us forward. It motivates us. It revs us up and directs our energies in all kinds of different ways. That is necessary. People who lack that, by the way, they fall into often a kind of depressed, unmotivated way of being. So as much as we're in tune with our emotions, we're able to use them as a guide to orient us in the world. We are not overwhelmed by our emotions or controlled or dominated by our moods. We're not impulsive, where our moods own us. We're a slave to our passions, a slave to impulse. So we're able to regulate our emotions effectively. And, we don't have to compartmentalize or detach from some part of the experience either. And it's through our moods and emotions that we're also able to have that self-understanding on an emotional level, a felt understanding, but it also connects us with other people vis-a-vis, compassion and sympathy and empathy. So again, at the level of thought and feeling, we have the ability to be increasingly in possession of our own thoughts. We're not dominated by thoughts that are not ours. We're not a slave to our emotions, our passions. We're able to use our emotions as a guide. Our emotions are not the enemy, but they also don't dominate our lives either. And then if we have that stability and yet some flexibility, some free play, some movement, then the behavioral possibilities are now revealed to us in the first person as more nuanced and varied. And that expands the realm within which our agency is able to exercise its power and choice. We can appropriate various courses of actions now that we couldn't before. We can see nuance and complexity in a way that we couldn't before. And this expands our psychological freedom and our ability increasingly to choose who we are, to live in accordance with our truest sense of what matters to us and what our values are, as opposed to being dominated by our moods and by various kinds of dogma. So notice how this definition that I'm putting forward, a definition of mental health that would prioritize psychological freedom, notice how that is not the same, and it may actually be at times at odds with a definition that would prioritize the absence of distressing symptoms. Okay? So with that expanding range of agency, the psychological freedom, and our ability to think in all these complex and nuanced ways, to entertain the possibility that we might be mistaken, to have that intellectual humility, to be able to be with our emotions but not be dominated by them, and so on. It expands our psychological freedom. But within that freedom comes responsibility. Responsibility to ourselves, responsibility to our friends, our family, our loved ones, and responsibility perhaps to our fellow human being. And as many people know, responsibility can be burdensome. It can be onerous. It can be heavy. It can be a weight. It can be very uncomfortable. So much so that Dostoevsky suggested that humans will do nearly anything to avoid that personal responsibility for their lives, for determining, what is good, what is bad, what they ought to be doing, and to own their lives with authenticity. Most people will instinctively flee from that. So responsibility can be uncomfortable. It can be very uncomfortable. But this is part of, in my opinion, what psychological health is. So many people, rather than have that freedom and the responsibility that comes with it, they would prefer to be a kind of psychic slave, either a slave to some dogma, some ideology, or a slave to the passions, to one's emotions. There is a kind of happiness, perhaps, in that kind of slavery, or in being comfortably numb and detached from many of our emotions and reality, really. Another way of coming at some of this, and it was suggested by Nietzsche, that maybe not psychological health, but certainly psychological strength could be measured by the extent to which a person can bear the truth. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that statement as well. So as many people know, so when we expand our intellectual horizons and the complexity and our tolerance for nuance and ambiguity and all the rest of it, which is itself uncomfortable, right? We have to be able to regulate our emotions to be able to do that. That is a feat to be able to achieve that. So with all that expanding, kind of awareness of what is and our ability to kind of regulate our emotions effectively, we are better positioned to ascertain the truth. And the truth, as many people know, can be, wow, it can be uncomfortable, it can be painful, it can be ugly, it can force you to look at yourself in the mirror and come to terms with some of your faults and failures and so on. And so the truth can be heavy, it can be hard, but all of this expanding psychological freedom, it's almost like we become a conduit for the truth. The truth is more capable of manifesting itself through us, I believe. And I think that's a beautiful thought. I think that's a beautiful idea. And I don't mean truth, with a capital T, as in like that you arrive at some dogma or some rigid ideology or something like that. It's provisional, right? But you're more likely to be in that place where you could see the world as it is, as correct as maybe you can get to that place, whatever that is. So we can be our most authentic selves. And again, this is a Nietzschean idea. To become who we are without, the ideological trappings, the rigid frames that restrict and narrow our interpretation, our understanding of the world, to make it more palatable. No, we can tolerate the complexity, we can tolerate the nuance, the ambiguity, and all the rest of it. So we can increasingly. And again, we can engage with these feelings in such a way that we can, without the emotional straitjacket that binds us up, that restricts us, that prevents us from being our most authentic selves, we can finally tear all this off and we can be our most authentic selves. And I think that's what mental health is. I think that's, or at least that's what I would tend to prioritize. So I'm going to part with this. I'm going to ask you, the question, who are you? Who are you really? Do you know yet? Do any of us know? Maybe we're all on that journey together, but do you have the will to find out?